Aloha, welcome to the new Oceania interview series. My name is Craig Santos Perez. I'm a director of the Creative Writing Program. We're joined with our special guest Konai Helu Thaman, who's visiting us all the way from Fiji, who just gave the most amazing poetry performance. We have a group of her biggest fans here to ask her questions. I'll be the first. How did you become a poet?
Well, it's a long story. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't like English literature. I didn't like studying English, and my English was terrible when I went to high school, because I went to a Thaman speaking elementary school. But at Tonga High School, speaking in Tongan was forbidden, and you had to do punishment duty if you were caught speaking in Tongan. So I developed this kind of ambivalence towards the English language, and I didn't speak unless I absolutely had to. And so I was quiet most of the time, and for 2 years I was awarded the Best Behavior Prize. In those days they gave prizes for good behavior in the classroom. So I just barely managed to pass the school certificate English, and when I came back from New Zealand to teach at Tonga High School, I was asked to teach English by the principal. So I struggled because I was teaching something I was not very passionate about. And so I began writing verses just to illustrate to my students certain aspects of poetry that they needed to understand before we moved on to the set text, the famous poems. And that's how I started. I learned something attending a creative writing class that was offered by the USB Center in Tonga. And then later on, I grew to like it, to like writing. And I would write about things that I felt very strongly about, and filed it away, and didn't really show anybody until we went to California with my husband, and I did my master's at UC Santa Barbara, and had a very good friend who was doing her master's in the English department. So I used to go with her to their poetry reading, and I got to really like it. And I was encouraged to write, to keep on writing. And then later on, one of my poems was published by the South Pacific Creative Arts Society, which was started by Albert Wendt and Professor Crocombe and his wife Marjorie, and Howard Van Trees. So You, the Choice of My Parents appeared in the Pacific Islands Monthly magazine, but it was originally Wife's Lament that I had submitted. They liked it, but they suggested that the title be changed, and I was very happy that they changed the title. I just was so happy that they were going to publish it. So that was the first published poem I had. I had written some poems when I was in New Zealand as for school magazines and stuff, but they were just, I suppose, ramblings. And then when I came to the University of South Pacific, Albert Wendt was already there, and so I joined the Creative Arts Society, and we began a movement which I think became what is now known as the first wave of Pacific writing in English. So my collection, You, the Choice of My Parents, came out as my first collection. So I continued writing ever since. For selfish reasons, it's very therapeutic for me, but I find that the students also enjoy it, as it gives them a kind of introduction to literature. And I now like to read, whereas before I really didn't like to read very much. But I still don't read as much as I should, I guess. I do a lot of reading of, reference books that had to do with my work. And of course, I am not in the English department. The professors of English will probably turn in their grave if they know that I'm kind of pretending to be a poet. But I enjoy writing, and so I write for myself and I write for young people because I think I have a message, particularly about our cultures, that need to be conveyed to young people, because I see that many of them are turning away from it, and I think it's mainly because they think it's boring and it's not useful. But I think it is very useful, particularly at this time of our lives when the world is talking about sustainable livelihoods. And we heard from the students in their presentations about the importance of traditional resource management, treating the earth as if you're part of it, not because, rather than treating the earth as if it was your slave and a source of income. So, yeah. So I think there's still a lot to be done. There's still a lot of things to be written about, and I'm just so happy here to see the young people embracing not only writing, but writing about their own cultures and their own experiences.
Well, thank you for sharing that story with us, and thank you for creating all this beautiful poetry for us, future waves of Pacific writers, to be inspired by, and to really know deeply that poetry is useful for us, not only in terms of art making or expression, but also in terms of maintaining our cultures, caring for our environments, and kind of connecting to other peoples around the world. So, mahalo.
I want to echo what Craig said, Konai, and say Virakamaka Mbimbi and Malo Pito for your work that's made possible the work of second and third wave writers after you, of Pacific women and men, creative writers and scholars. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for your reading today. I wanted to ask you particularly about, you're a model for us as a doctor, as an academic, as well as a creative writer. We've talked about here in the Pacific literature classes about this tradition of Pacific writers, scholars, that so many Pacific scholars are also writers, so many writers are also scholars, and I was struck as you gave the talk the other day at CPIS by the way that you combine creative writing and poetry and your scholarship. So I was hoping you might speak a little bit more to this, how you weave together scholarship and poetry.
Yeah, I think to me, in my experience, the tradition of academic writing and the whole academy thing, expectations of research and publishing in ranked journals and publishing things which are so esoteric that only a few people would be able to read your article. And for me, I think this reflects the notion of being an educated person and what is education for. I think traditionally in our various indigenous cultures, there was always a purpose. Learning was for a purpose. Learning, or ako, or whatever it is in your culture, is to obtain some knowledge so that you can use that knowledge in a positive way to help others, to help your family, extended family, or the collective. So it wasn't the notion of learning for its own sake, which I think is a very Western take on learning. I think the educationist R.S. Peters talks about learning for its own sake as education, and learning for a particular purpose is training. So I did some research on Tongan notions of learning, of teaching, and knowledge, and I also found from other Pacific researchers that this was the same for them. It was to obtain this wisdom of Poto or Yalamatua in Fiji, and Wana Wana in Kiribati. And it was all for the improvement of the group, of the collective. So I think that that notion is certainly for me is I've taken that with me into my academic work. And I know as a teacher in a university, that is the students, my students, if I don't use examples that they can relate to, and some of those is in the poetry, it just becomes such a boring thing. And they can sit there and smile and nod their head and will go away and they haven't learned a thing. And so I have kind of devoted my professional life into trying to pass on that message that even at university, you have to contextualize what you're doing. You can't just come and stand there and give a lecture about your own little field of interest and think that the students are going to understand. And so as a technique, I guess, as a teacher, I am basically a teacher. I could write poetry or be a professor, but deep down I am a teacher. And for me, my philosophy of teaching is very autobiographic. For me, teaching is a luba. It is the sharing of what I have with my students. And I find it very difficult to accept the new notion of the teacher as a facilitator of learning, where you don't really share, you just kind of come up with some questions and let the students themselves find their own way, so to speak. Because I have seen that if you really connect with the students, they will be able to think, and they can do it. They can think on their own. But for certainly the kinds of students that I deal with, there needs to be that connection. Otherwise, it's very few of them would learn without that connection. And that, to me, separates a lot of Pacific Island students from, say, students in the U.S. that I used to be with and learn with. Students in New Zealand, the Pakeha students in New Zealand. There is that kind of element of some kind of personal connection, I find. And I believe, I still believe that unless you develop that personal connection with your students, it's very difficult to get your message across. So I use the poetry in my academic writing. I weave it in there as a way of better, I suppose, transmitting my message. And I find over the years it works. Sometimes people forget what my thesis is about, but they remember what a poem or 2 poems that I read to them. That speaks to them, rather than the kind of dry, boring, discourse that I'm talking about sustainable development. And I suppose as a person, as a teacher, I want my students to understand what I'm talking about. Whether that's colonizing or not, I don't know. I like to think of it as just helping them to learn. And my God, there are millions of students in our part of the world who are not learning in school, and they're dropping out by the hundreds. And when you ask them, the school is boring. They are frightened of the teachers. There's nothing in school that is speaking to them. And the consequences of that is really very bad. We could have another conference on that, of what the school doesn't do to our children. And we are very lucky, those of us who are here, that we managed to do well in school. But the majority of Pacific Island students, whether they are in the Pacific or elsewhere, school is very, very difficult for them, let alone get into university. And some of that has to do with the fact that we have not found, better ways of getting through and connecting with the students. Because we know as human beings that when you don't connect with someone, you can just talk, across each other, and it's not different from the classroom.
Thank you.
Aloha people of Konai. I just wanted to ask you, have you written anything in Tongan? And has it been published? Because I don't recall seeing anything in
No,
Tongan.
I haven't published anything in Tongan, but I'll let you in to a secret. Some of my poems I write first in Tongan, and that is to get the imagery, to get valid imageries, appropriate images. So then when I get the images, then I write in English. But in order to get, it's not just the imagery, it's maybe the inspiration. So I do it first in Tongan, and then I try to formulate the verse in English. There's one, I can give you an example of, there's a poem called No Problem, which I wrote when a good friend and mentor, Kawainga Havea, passed away. He was on our staff. And so the poem is like a lament. When you're growing up in Tonga, you go with your elders to funerals, and you hear the old people, especially the women, reciting what I think is great poetry, in their wailing. Some of them are not, you don't see the tears, but what they're doing is they're reciting the history of their connection to the deceased. And it sometimes, if they're angry with somebody, this all comes up in the poetry. If they're happy, it comes up in the poetry. And so I was trying to, when I wrote the original version of No Problem, I was talking to Kawainga, why have you decided to go, and things like that. You've left us like this and that. So the whole original of that poem was in Tongan. It was like I was crying at his funeral. We never got to go to his funeral because he died in New Zealand. So then I translated that into English, and that's what No Problem, background, No Problem. I once spoke with Uncle Futa about it. He said to me, why aren't you publishing in Tongan? And I said, because Tongan poetry has to rhyme. Traditional Tongan poetry, to be good, has to rhyme, and I can't. I can write poems that rhyme, but I don't. Not all my poems rhyme. And then he said, well, you can start a tradition of non-rhyming Tongan poetry. But that's my Uncle Futa. Yeah, he's always thinking outside the box. I think maybe that's why I want to go write children's books in Tongan. Again, it's for instrumental reasons, because I wanted my students to appreciate English, writing in English, and to help them get through their English exams. And a lot of our students, it's not that they can't think, it's just that their language skills not adequate. And we talk about a very deep subject in the Tongan language. Unfortunately, when the exam comes, they have to write essays in English, and that would be another story. And then most of the time they are not able to do it. So, I'm so passionate about the need for our young people to do well, and people have asked me, well, but that means that they are going to master the language of the colonizer. And I said, you have to master the language of the colonizer if you want to decolonize. Otherwise, what's decolonizing? What's that about? But I do envy people who write, like Amelia. She just sat there and wrote her song. I mean, what she wrote could be put into music. It would be a beautiful song. One of the Hiva Kakalas, that you hear, the men usually. I would love to Imala to put music to your, or you can put music to your own poem and get your daughters to sing them. I think that would be the best tribute, to mothers ever. Her poem is just so profound in terms of the the role of mothers, not just in Tonga but everywhere. Thank you, Amelia.
On that beautiful sentiment, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Oh.
So I wanted to thank you again for visiting our campus, for sharing
you.
your poetry and your thoughts with us today. We hope you travel safe back home, and we hope to get to see you again soon.
Thank you. It's great to be here.